This is San Francisco.
Welcome to San Francisco, where according to the mayor of San Francisco, London Breed,
people who deal drugs have more rights than people who try to get up and go to work every day and take their children to school. People who come from a particular country, come from Honduras, and a lot of the people who are dealing drugs happen to be of that ethnicity.
San Francisco's mayor and her donors in the tech and real estate industry are blaming Hondurans for the record number of overdoses in the city. And so while the mayor is leaving a legacy as the queen of ODs, throwing money at cops and building these jails she initially wanted to call behavioral health justice centers, the traditional media has helped to spread the anti-Latinx sentiment around. The mayor's anti-immigrant racism was supported by a series of articles at the San Francisco Chronicle that's been running on and off since July. It started with an article with the headline, "Honduran migrants have taken over the sale of fentanyl in the open-air markets of San Francisco." And it quoted a source who called people migrating here a cancer. The Chronicle fed the racists and the war on drugs with their pieces, and its editors defended them using disingenuous language, saying, "Look, we're going to the root cause of the overdose crisis with these articles," when the pieces are actually really shallow, never looking into how the U.S. brought poverty and violence to Central America with programs like the School of the Americas and funding the drug war. The Chronicle has been obsessing over Honduras while paying a lot less attention to, for example, locals like Joanne Segovia, who is the former police union director for San Jose, who initially tried to blame her housekeeper for the packages of fentanyl showing up at Joanne's door. Donors don't want to see unhoused people in tents from the windows of their Teslas on the way to decompression. And so politicians that work for these donors, they're running out of people to blame, so why not Honduras? At 48 Hills, Tim Redmond wrote about how the right wing in San Francisco, who like to call themselves the moderate Democrats, they can't blame the DA since they helped to put her in office, and they can't blame the mayor since they supported her and her DA candidate, and they can't blame the cops since the mayor hires the chief. So now they're going to try to blame the judges. And that's what they've been doing with posters targeting judges who have been overseeing some of these drug cases. One of the people that is likely behind the posters is Michael Moritz, who is a venture capitalist with a net worth of $5 billion, who is on the board of Stripe and Instacart. He spent a few $1 million launching the San Francisco Standard, which has been a cheerleader for the drug war along with the mayor. Michael Moritz wrote a New York Times opinion piece in February titled, "Even Democrats like me are fed up with San Francisco," basically explaining how San Francisco is a shithole because we don't give the mayor more power. He also funds a bunch of YIMBY groups in town and is one of the people who bought up 50,000 acres in Solano County where they want to build a new tech utopian city. Moritz helped to fund these pro-war on drugs posters that are part of this campaign called That's Fentanyl. And also, I presume, is the one behind posters targeting judges who have overseen some of the drug cases in town. All these posters have been ripped down soon after they've gone up. Nestor Castillo is here to talk more about this. He's a contributor to El Tecolote, which is the media outlet based in the Mission. The conversation with Nestor is on after the break.
I think just as you put it, right, this sort of subtle racism, it's sneaky racist, right? You read it and you say, well, are they intentionally trying to be racist? It's like giving a redwood size bundle of Kindle to folks who are already sort of feeling like, yeah, immigrants are nothing but criminals. They're bad people, right? This is the same sort of rhetoric that we hear time and time again. It just sort of reaffirms those beliefs. It starts off by like saying like, this is groundbreaking, seminal journalism. The piece sort of outlines this, I think it was like 18-month long investigation in which the journalists from the Chronicle try to make connections between Honduran migrants, and this small town in El Valle de Siria, or the Syria Valley, in which there are all of these new developments, new construction that have Bay Area iconography, San Francisco iconography, things like the Golden Gate Bridge, the San Francisco 49ers logo, decorating these houses. And the connection is that this is drug money that's fueling this development boom in El Valle de Siria with very little evidence, right, provided. But the gist of what the piece was pretty much is the connection between Honduran immigrants who are poisoning the streets of San Francisco with drugs, are making hand over fist money and sending it back to Honduras. These basically, like, these are these parasites that's the other way that it can be read, right? It's like these are these parasitic individuals who are taking all of our money, no mention of the consumers of the drugs, right? Building these lavish houses in Honduras that, again, you could read into it, right? Are they deserving of these homes? Should immigrants have nice things? These are all the other ways I think that this article could be read. And of course, the folks on Twitter would say, well, no, they never said anything like that, right? You're reading too much into it. And that's exactly what we should be doing with these pieces, is analyzing them critically.
Yeah. And a piece like this does have real world effects. As you pointed out, soon after the piece came out, there was one of the local supervisors, Matt Dorsey, as a result of the piece, this piece of yellow journalism that he had read in the SF Chronicle, turned around and was like pointing to the piece, and he was saying, well, now I want to go to the public defender's office and I want to make sure that we're not spending money on dealers. But yeah, I mean, what are some of the real world effects that a piece like this can have?
Yeah, I mean, I think the worst aspects of what journalism like this can do is just sort of exactly what you laid out, right? Is like, it's a sort of the ripple effect of it, right? After this piece, after the piece that I wrote, I had people from the public defender's office like DM me and say, like, the journalists came, they interviewed us, and they used none of what we told them in their piece, right? Like, they totally just ignored everything that we said, right? And just like the real context of, so it's fascinating to see like both the ripple effect in both ways, right? Of like people realizing that not the entire story was told here. But my real fear with a piece like this was that there could be like potential acts of violence, right? Especially in the sort of political climate that we're in a country like ours, in which we see racially motivated violence on the up. This could be like that. My worst sort of fear is like a group of vigilantes that are like, the city refuses to take action. We've seen the facts. Like, we don't need to know anything else. And then there's the aspects of, if folks are in a proceeding, trying to get asylum, and something like this comes up, right? They're not granted asylum, right? And they're deported back to a place like Honduras or a place like El Salvador, right? Throughout Central America, there are real threats to folks who are denied asylum. And so, I think that all feeds into, again, this anti-immigrant, xenophobic rhetoric that ends up becoming, as you said, right? Like there are real consequences to that, because whether it be through policy or it be through sort of individual acts of hatred or racism, people's lives are impacted by these pieces.
I was wondering if you could also speak a little bit about how a piece like this might play into creating a kind of good immigrant versus bad immigrant narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think historically that's always kind of been there, right? And so this is just another piece that adds to that. It's tough because I go back and my own like reaction is like, oh, the city's changed, right? Like, especially like going to a place like the Mission, which is where I spent the most of my time. My grandmother used to live in the Excelsior. My grandfather used to live in the Mission District. And so it's like watching it transform, right? And you take a piece like this one, especially if you're newer to San Francisco and you say, but you haven't seen San Francisco change over the past 2 decades, right? Or over the past 3 decades, or when my parents arrived to San Francisco in the 1980s, what the San Francisco Mission was like. And you sort of throw this piece in a vacuum, right? And you say, without acknowledgement of COVID, without acknowledgement of like the rising prices of goods and like the fact that people are in real need and that jobs don't pay well, right? And all of a sudden you might even say, these immigrants, man, like you might find yourself leaning in that, right? Without that sort of broader context or without knowing of like, for example, why is it that Central Americans have been coming to a place like San Francisco since the early 1900s, right? Like it's the Central American community has been here due to the coffee trade between Central America and coffee companies that are here, right? So if you don't have any of that context, right, it does create this narrative of who are these immigrants? What are they offering to us, right? What I get really frustrated with that piece is as I think more and more about it, as more time goes by, sometimes will wake me up in the middle of the night and I scream, thinking about the ways in which this piece sort of still haunts me. It could have been such a real piece with like nuance and which I think the authors state that that's what they're sort of striving for. But I was just reading, because I was thinking about the Valle de Siria and how like there's this, throughout Honduras, there are these environmentalists that are organizing and fighting against extractive companies, right? They do mention the mining, but there was a environmentalist who was actually murdered in 2019 in that area. And he was tortured and shot, and like there's no mention of it. I found it through a Google search, like as I was trying to learn more about Valle, because I honestly didn't know a lot about that area. But it doesn't take much to sort of begin to, as you're looking into it. But again, that's not what their purpose was in researching this piece. Their purpose was to reaffirm that Hondureños are drug dealers. So that's the questions that they asked, right? Good. If it was like sort of even within that binary of good versus bad, right? If they were saying, well, we want to search out the good Hondureños, right? And say like, well, who are these folks that are fighting to make their communities more resilient, to fight back against extractive mining companies? What if we looked into that piece, right? And they would have maybe learned about this environmentalist who was tortured and killed, and whose murder I think there's impunity in that it hasn't been solved, right? But it's that, that's what sort of wakes me up in the middle of the night where I say, God, what a missed opportunity.
With, the reference to the environmentalist who was killed in 2019, and we'll include a link in the show notes about that. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the history of how the U.S. has meddled in Central America.
Yeah, I think it's damn near impossible to talk about migration, I think, especially when we're talking about Central American migration, but migration from Latin America, without talking about the role that the U.S. plays, interventions that the U.S. has had in governments all over the world, but really throughout Latin America. The coup that took place in Guatemala, that was the sort of starting point for U.S. hegemony in Latin America. You can go further back, right, and look at the Monroe Doctrine. But most historians, I think, will put it at that turning point in the 50s, in which, after World War II, right, the U.S. is left as the sole dominant power, trying to divorce the role that the U.S. plays in Central America or Latin America. It's important to understand that a lot of what drives certain economic policies in Latin America and Central America is dictated by the U.S., right? It's dictated by the global powers. And so when you look at a place like Honduras, which in the 1970s and 80s was referred to as the USS Honduras, because it was the sort of stationing ground for the conflicts that took place in Nicaragua, that took place in El Salvador and in Guatemala, the U.S. was using Honduras as its base, right? As the country as a military base. And, that's the other piece of it, right? When we get back to the drugs and drug dealing, is the role that the funneling millions of dollars, as it continues to do all over the world, right, without any sort of oversight or checking, leads to corruption, right? And we know that there are military officials who are tied to drug dealing and cartels since the 1980s until today, right? And so The Intercept did this piece about, in the current Honduran government, a military official who's tied to narco trafficking, not to mention that the former president who was convicted, former president who was basically arrested by the U.S. government, and his brother, who was convicted in New York for drug trafficking. So it's at the very top levels of the conservative right-wing party in Honduras. And so, if you look at just the history of militarism in the country from the 1980s till now, Central American Free Trade Agreement, economic free trade zones that benefit large corporations, the coup d'etat that took out the first sort of left-leaning president, Mel Zelaya, ousted him from power only to install this conservative party that we had up until recently. To get back to the question, right, of what is feeding migration, what is pushing people out of a place like Honduras or Central America, what is the role of the U.S. in all of this? All of these are factors. The gangs that is often the focus of in Central America when we're talking about, policing and crime, right? Those gangs were not birthed in Central America. They were birthed here in the United States, in LA, right? They were migrants who were living in Los Angeles, who formed these gangs because that was the culture of Los Angeles to a certain extent, right? In order to protect themselves from other gangs that had been existing there, because they arrived in communities that didn't have necessarily the social safety net or opportunities to coexist with other communities, right? These are all the factors. This SF Chronicle piece either completely ignored. You would think that because it's an 18-month-long investigation that they might have had pieces ready that went more in depth, that explored some of these sort of complex issues. But so far, we haven't gotten any of that.
Right. Instead, we have to sort of wait for people from outside of the institution of the Chronicle to offer opinion pieces, which the Chronicle has printed a few of in the wake of the original article. However, it's kind of an indication of how seriously readers are supposed to take it if a piece appears in the opinion section versus the rest of the paper. So keep that in mind as you are looking into this further. If you have any recommendations for people to keep up on news like this, what are some other sources that are not the Chronicle?
Yeah, well, I'm always going to make a plug for the little paper that could, El Tecolote, out of the Mission District, which is a the longest bilingual running neighborhood newspaper, I think, in the country, if I'm not mistaken. And you'll find some of my pieces on there, although now with less regularity, but you'll find other great pieces. The editor there, Alexis Terrazas, is great. I recommend reading El Tecolote, but then there are, plenty of alternative sites and places you could get your news. I personally enjoy KPFA and the good folks over at Pacifica Radio and Democracy Now! And The Intercept, right? Those are, I think, the places that I often rely on.
And in addition to checking out your stuff at El Tecolote, is there anywhere else people can follow you online?
Yeah, I'm on social media. I'm on Twitter, Prof. Ness C. And
we'll link it up on the show notes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, but if you search me up, you'll find my stuff, and you'll mostly see tweets about the Golden State Warriors. But every now and then, you'll get some more substance from me.
Find more episodes of Sad Francisco, which is produced by Toshio Moronic and Caitlin Wood, at patreon.com/sadfrancisco. See you next time in Sad Francisco.